Every year, my family and I take a yearly vacation as part of us being able to spend time together. Usually it's to a beach house that's owned by our cousins. While it's nothing fancy, it's still something we love to do together. Well, the year before I went to college out of state, we decided to go one last time, since I knew that I wouldn't really have the time to go often after that. We left and made our way there. On the first night there, everyone else seemed to be exhausted, so I told my parents that since they were sleepy, they could stay in, and I was just going to go and venture out by myself. They weren't too concerned since we'd been here often, and I knew the way around. I headed out, and after driving, I found a nightclub that looked like it was busy enough. I parked and paid the fee to get in. Walking in, I was immediately overtaken by the loud noises and bass vibrating off the floor. Not knowing exactly where to begin, I just sort of slipped into the background. I hadn't been there long when I noticed someone coming up beside me. It was a man. He looked to be a little older than me, and I noticed he was holding a beer in his hand. As if it were effortless, he leaned up against the wall and flashed me a smile. I returned it, and he introduced himself as Vic. We talked for a while, and when he offered me a drink, I declined. Sure, I'd drank before, but I didn't feel like doing it right then. He seemed to be fine with that, and we moved on. We talked about things from what we like to do to family, and before long it seemed like hours melted by. He seemed pleasant, and he lacked a dangerous aura, so when he asked if I wanted to take a walk, I was fine with it. We made our way to the beach and took a nice stroll back towards the beach house. Before we got too close though, I told him this was my stop, just so he wouldn't know exactly where I was staying. I didn't even have time to register what happened next, but he kissed me. Surprisingly, I kissed back. We exchanged numbers and I went on my way, stopping to make sure he too had also left. Since we were staying for a week and a half, me and Vic hung out often. If I wasn't with my family, we'd be out just walking around. Heck, I even let him join us when we went to a nearby amusement park. Even there, he was as polite as can be. While he wasn't super muscular, he was definitely toned, and his dark hair made his dark brown eyes seem even more so. I'm pretty sure my mom was even stricken by his looks. They also liked how he was well-mannered. After a solid week of talking and hanging out, I knew that my time here was about to be over, and I would have to head back to the real world soon enough. That was why I never thought to take it further than a kiss. I also explained early on that this was a vacation, and I wouldn't be here for long. He seemed to understand. I soon found out that likely wasn't the case, except I found it out in likely the worst way possible. It all started 2 days before going back to the real world when we had been out on the beach. He had offered to teach me to surf, and I was thrilled. I had always loved the idea of it. While we were out there, I casually mentioned that I was leaving in 2 days, and he seemed bummed, but I assured him we could still text. As if it were nothing, he laughed a little bit before telling me that I could always stay there. Skip college. It would be pointless when I could have a happy life there, with him. The laugh made me think he was kidding, so I laughed with him and diverted the attention back to surfing. After a brief lesson, Vic suggested that we actually attempt to go into the water this time. I wasn't sure yet since I had just started, and we had all day. He insisted, bolstering my confidence. Ignoring the sinking pit in my stomach, we set out into the waters. Despite my apprehension, we kept going further and further out. Finally, I realized that we had left the shore behind us. On the board, we saw a wave coming up in the distance. He gave me a quick smile and said something about having my back. Both of us paddled out towards it and stood up. I felt ready, and for a brief moment, I thought everything was going to be fine. It wasn't until I was right at the wave that I realized this was too big for a beginner. I panicked. The wave slammed into me and sent me barreling into the salty water. I hit it with enough force that it knocked the air out of me. I barely managed to hold my breath before being pulled under the water. As I came up, I thought things were okay. I managed a quick inhale before I felt something else. This time, it wasn't something pulling me down from below. I felt hands pushing me down from above. I struggled to grasp what was happening, but then it hit me. Vic planned this. He wanted this to happen. I flailed until I felt my lungs burning. Then, all at once, I was back above water. I felt hands dragging me up. When I surfaced, it was Vic. I felt numb and confused all at once. I peppered him with questions such as, what in the world just happened? But he insisted that he had been trying to pull me up the entire time. I felt like I was being gaslit thoroughly. By the time we made it to shore, he almost had me convinced. Except that he had a sinister look about him. I was unsettled. Suddenly, he felt dangerous. He offered me lunch when we made it to dry land, but I quickly made an excuse that I had to go. Back at my beach house, I locked myself indoors. I was shaken enough that I didn't even want to go to dinner that night and opted to stay in. As soon as they left, I locked myself inside and closed every blind in the place. I even kept the TV off for good measure, instead hiding in my room with my cell phone and watching Netflix that way. It felt safer than being outside suddenly. It was about 30 minutes after my parents left that I heard the knocking. I had no idea how he knew where I was staying precisely, but judging by the reaction at the ocean earlier, I figured he'd just followed me without my knowledge. Not wanting to let him know I was inside, I kept quiet. He continued to beat on the door, and I heard him yelling. When I wasn't answering, he started to call me. When I hit ignore, he sent a text that chilled me. He knew I didn't go to dinner. I froze. Seconds later, I heard what sounded like him kicking the door. Throwing caution to the wind, I ran and slid a side table in front of the front door. I took a quick peek out the peephole, and I saw what looked like a gun on his hip. I called 911 right away, before texting my dad for help too. Honestly, I didn't care who got there first. I just locked myself in the bedroom and slid down the wall, hoping whoever it was made it before he somehow got inside. I cried happy tears when the cops arrived first. From inside the house, I heard screaming to get on the ground before the operator told me that a cop would knock 3 times. When I heard the knocks, I double-checked before opening it, and sure enough, a cop stood at the door. Vic was handcuffed and practically being dragged down the sidewalk. The officer took a statement and listened as I explained. He even stayed till my parents arrived. As he was leaving, the other guy came up and explained that they also found a rope and duct tape in his car. The realization of what could have happened hit me like a Mack truck. We didn't even wait to leave. My parents threw everything in a bag that night and we went home without a second thought. The next vacation we went on ended up being in a totally different state and a totally different beach. I also never attempted any particular friendship on that one either. My parents got divorced last year. Growing up, I'd always been closer to my mom, so I didn't really see my dad very much after that. One day, he called me out of the blue and said that we were going on a camping trip like we used to do when I was a kid. He didn't even ask me if I wanted to go. He just said we were going. I'd never liked camping, but I figured that he just wanted to reconnect with me, so I said sure. That weekend, we ended up trekking deep into the woods and set up our tent just as the sun was setting. We made a campfire and roasted hot dogs, and honestly, it was pretty nice. I could tell that Dad was really happy to be spending time with me. Then, out of nowhere, a little girl wandered into the clearing. She looked about 6 years old. She had long blonde hair and was wearing a dirty pink dress. We said hello and asked her where her family was. Without saying anything, she sat on the ground and just stared at us through the fire. "Does she need help?" I whispered to my dad. The girl didn't look worried or lost or anything. Her face was blank. We kept asking her who she was and where she came from, but all she did was stare. Then, she stood up and walked back into the woods. As soon as she stepped into the shadows, she stopped and turned back around. With one hand, she waved for us to follow her. Then, she ran into the darkness. I turned to my dad. "What do we do?" He said that she might be in shock or something. She might be lost and need our help. He started to stand up, but I tried to stop him. "Don't," I said. He didn't listen. He said that she was just a little girl searching for her parents. He told me to wait here while he went to find her. I told him it was a really bad idea, but he refused to listen. I could tell that this wasn't just about the little girl. It was us, about how he felt like he'd failed as a parent. He said that he'd be back as soon as possible, so he left me there and ran after the girl. I waited for 5 minutes before I started to get worried. The fire was starting to die out, and the woods got really quiet. I couldn't hear my dad anywhere. I couldn't hear anything. After 10 minutes, I knew that I'd have to go after him. I was terrified, but I didn't have a choice. I grabbed my flashlight and started to look around. I got farther and farther from our campsite, but I couldn't see any sign of that girl or my father. Suddenly, I made it to a cliff overlooking a deep valley. If I had been walking any faster, I probably would have walked right over the edge. I looked down at the ground far below, trying to see if my dad had fallen down there. The bushes were pretty thick, so I wasn't sure, but I couldn't see him. I turned back around and walked back to our campsite. By then, my heart was pounding. I kept thinking about that little girl. There was something very wrong about her. Had she done something to my father? Was he gone forever? When I made it back to camp, my fears instantly subsided. My dad was back, sitting next to the fire. I asked him what happened. He smiled at me and said, "I think it's time to put out the fire. You can do that, right?" He'd completely ignored my question. Sure," I said. Still smiling, he stood up and walked into our tent. He zipped it shut and went to sleep. I looked all around the clearing for that little girl, but I didn't see her. Who was she? And why didn't my father just answer my question? It was all so strange. I grabbed a bottle of water and extinguished the fire. Everything got very dark. I realized that the sounds still hadn't returned. The woods were still too quiet. I ran back to the tent and climbed inside. Once I zipped it shut, I felt so much safer. As long as Dad and I were in here together, I'd be okay. I crawled into my sleeping bag and turned to see if my dad was still awake. He wasn't there. I was the only one in the tent. But that was impossible. I watched my dad crawl inside the tent. There was no other way out. So where had he gone? My heart raced. I knew that I should have gone back outside and looked for him again, but I couldn't. I was too afraid. So I just lay there in my sleeping bag, silently praying that he'd come back. He never did. By the time the sun came up, I hadn't slept at all. In the daylight, I was able to see a lot better. I looked all around the woods, but I never found my father. I left our tent and everything else where it was, and I walked all the way back to the ranger station and reported my father missing. The ranger was an old guy. He seemed really sympathetic. He called 3 of his men to form a search party while he waited with me at the station. He gave me some coffee and assured me that his men would do everything they could. We sat for a while, and then he asked, "Before your dad went missing, did you see anyone else in the woods? Did you see a girl in a pink dress?" I nodded. His expression instantly dropped. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I don't think we'll find your father." And they didn't. This wasn't the first time that someone had disappeared in this area. No one knows who that girl is or what she does with the people who follow her. All we know is that once you see her, you're gone forever. I had just started working at my friend's dad's pizza shop, right around the corner from my house. I was 18 at the time, and it was my first real job. There would usually be 3 of us on shift. We offered deliveries, but the shop wasn't busy enough to have a full-time driver, so if ever there was a delivery, one of us would just take it out. Just after I started working there, I noticed this man used to come into the shop every night about 30 minutes before closing. He would order a drink and sit down by the window, sipping it, until he was asked to leave after we'd closed. I asked my colleague what his deal was, but he just said he didn't know, but had been doing it for months. About 2 weeks later, it was just me and one other guy working late, and as usual, the guy comes in and orders his drink about 30 minutes before close. He seems to notice that there's only 2 of us as he looks around the shop and asks, "Where's the other guy?" "Oh, he's sick, so it's just us 2 tonight." He pulls out a phone and starts texting. 2 minutes later, the phone rings, and a last-minute order for delivery comes in on the other side of town. My colleague decided to take it out and left me there with the man alone, saying to lock up, clean down, and wait for him to get back to cash up together. Shortly after my friend had left for the delivery, the man got up and went into the customer toilets. After about 5 minutes, I heard a scream coming from the toilet. I ran in to check if the man was okay, and as I ran through the door, he grabbed me from behind and put a knife to my throat. "Stay calm, stay quiet, and it'll all be over soon." I was scared and confused. What will all be over? What's happening? He made me empty my pockets by taking my keys, phone, and wallet. We stood there for 5 minutes before he told me he's going to leave me there and to not come out until someone comes in to get me. I was scared shitless. I waited for what seemed like 20 minutes when my friend came in looking for me. I explained what happened, and he called the police from his phone. He said the delivery call was a prank, and when he got to the address, they said they never ordered anything. We checked the CCTV, and when I was being held in the toilet, 2 other men came in and emptied the cash register and safe. He must have been watching us all this time and noting our routines. He knew where the money was, where the keys were, and that if there were only 2 people on shift, one would still leave to run a delivery. I still work there, but we have a new policy on how many people must stay in the shop now. When I was a sophomore in high school, there used to be this kid called Brendan that everyone took a dislike to. He used to think he was some kind of bully and that people were scared of him, but the truth of the matter was, most people just didn't like him. At school, we were made to do regular lockdown drills as a precaution, and these were always scary, as when you stopped to think about it, it made you realize that school wasn't always a safe place to be, and any day could be your last. Today was just like any other drill day. The sirens sound, the announcement comes over the speakers, the teacher locks the door, and we all sit down at the back of the room, out of sight, with our backs against the wall. As we did this, Brendan just stood there in the middle of the classroom. Our history teacher, Mr. Cleaver, called Brendan to come and sit down. Brendan reached behind him as if he was going to take something out of his back pocket and pulled out a handgun. He stood there and pointed the gun right at Mr. Cleaver and told him to turn and face the wall. Mr. Cleaver did as he was asked. Brendan then pointed the gun at me and told me to stand up and face the wall, and one by one, he made everyone stand and face the wall and then place our hands on our heads. As this was during a practice drill, no one outside the class even knew this was going on, and no one was coming to our aid. Brendan started talking about how people should be careful about how they treat the quiet kid.
"What's the saying? The quiet ones are usually the worst?"
He laughed.
"Well, you're about to find out exactly what that means."
Just as he said that, the alarms and announcements stopped, and to everyone else, a normal school day resumed. Generally, the principal would come round after the drill had finished to find out how we did. The teacher would give feedback if there were any improvements that needed to be made, or if anyone acted out of line. When the principal arrived at our classroom, it took him a few attempts of him checking the door and telling us the lockdown was over before he realized the situation. You could hear his shoes echoing as he ran down the hallway. There was both a sigh of relief and panic that came over me. Then the sirens started sounding again, and an announcement came over the speakers.
"Full lockdown. This is not a drill. Full lockdown. This is not a drill."
Up until now, I think most of us locked in the classroom had managed to remain calm, but hearing the announcement just seemed to bring the situation more into reality. A few of my classmates started to whimper and sob the longer time went on, the more you started to think the worst was going to happen. Brendan didn't really say anything. He didn't have any demands or want anything from anyone. I could hear him pacing behind us while we all stood there with our faces pressed against the wall. Brendan slapped something on the desk. I'm not sure what it was, but it made us all jump. At first I thought he had shot someone, and I think we all had the same thought. You could hear him snigger as those of us that were whimpering now started to cry and begged to be saved and let go. We could hear the sound of the police driving up the school entrance. And as we did, Brendan ordered Mr. Cleaver to back up slowly and turn and approach him. Then he told us all to turn around and face him with our hands still on our heads. Brendan stood there pointing the gun right between the teacher's eyes. We were all about to witness Mr. Cleaver getting shot. Out of nowhere, Brendan slowly placed the gun in front of Mr. Cleaver. There was some hesitation, but then Mr. Cleaver swiped the gun from the desk, and Brendan just stood there with this huge grin on his face. We all continued to stand with our hands on our heads, not knowing if it was safe enough to move yet. For all we knew, Brendan could have had another gun. Mr. Cleaver moved towards the door, never taking his eyes off Brendan. He unlocked and then opened the door. As the police moved into the hall, Mr. Cleaver slid the gun into the hall with his foot and shouted that the gunman had been disarmed. Mr. Cleaver was put in cuffs as a formality, and as the police entered the room, we all pointed to Brendan. Brendan was arrested, and we never saw him in school after that. I'm not sure what the lesson he was trying to teach us was, but our parents were later informed that the gun was only a replica and couldn't actually shoot bullets. As scary as it was, Brendan never intended to hurt any of us. Not physically, anyway.
There are 3 theaters in my city, but people only go to 2 of them. The third is inside a dead mall in the sketchy part of town. I hadn't been there in years. Honestly, I didn't even know it was still open. Then last week, my boyfriend Danny and I were shopping at the supermarket when this old lady ran over to us and handed me 2 free passes to the theater. It happened so fast that I didn't even get to see her face before she was gone. I wasn't interested in the tickets, but Danny has always been extremely frugal. He'd never pass up anything free. The passes expired that day, so it was either now or never. We argued for a bit, but then I gave in, like I always do, and he drove us over to the cinema. We didn't even know what was playing. Danny just said that we'd watch whatever was on. When we got there, we had to walk through the old mall. Most of the stores were closed. Aside from the theater, the only businesses that were open were dollar stores and pawn shops. Aside from the workers, Danny and I didn't see a single other customer in the entire building. At the entrance to the theater, an old man greeted us at the ticket counter. He was wearing an old-fashioned usher uniform. He asked if we wanted to see the 6 o'clock show. That was 10 minutes away, so it would be perfect timing. I asked what the movie was, because there were no posters anywhere, and he got angry and shouted, "Do you want to see the movie or not?" I had a really bad feeling. I wanted to leave, but Danny pushed me to the side and gave the man our free passes. The man took them and tore off the stubs. He told us to go to screen number 1. Danny wrapped his arm around me and guided me inside the theater. The lobby looked like it hadn't been changed or cleaned since I was here as a kid. All the decorations were old and covered in dust. The frames that would normally show posters of new releases were all blank, except for one with a pure black poster and one word written in white: Judgment. I'd never heard of a movie called Judgment before, and the poster had no other information on it. I turned to Danny and told him that I wanted to leave. He got a little huffy and said, "Fine, you can go if you want, but I'm not." I knew better than to argue with him. I'd been with Danny long enough to know that he'd be sulking for days if he didn't get his way. Even if he was as creeped out as I was, he'd refuse to back down. He started walking into screen number 1, and I followed. There were only 6 other people in the audience, all couples. Each couple sat in different rows and in total silence. Danny picked a spot near the front, but he had to move over a couple of seats because the ones he chose were broken. Most of the chairs were. It was 5:57, 3 minutes before the movie was supposed to start, when someone whispered at us from 2 rows back. I turned around and saw Lindsay, one of my friends from high school. She asked me what we were doing here. I told her about the free passes, and she said that the exact same thing happened to her. She glanced at her boyfriend nervously. I knew she was weirded out by this place too, and I knew that her boyfriend was forcing her to come, just like mine was. He had a tight grip around her wrist. With just 1 minute before the show started, the old curtain spread open to reveal a torn and dusty screen. I don't know what set me off. Maybe it was the horrible noise that the curtains made when they opened. Maybe it was the annoyed look on my boyfriend's face. Maybe it was the dry, dead smell that filled the room. Whatever the reason, I couldn't stay there any longer. All my instincts were telling me to leave. I whispered to Danny that I had to go. I was too scared. Danny glared at me and said, "Yeah? Then why don't you leave?" So I did. For the first time in our relationship, I went against Danny and left. I'd wait for him in the mall. I knew that he'd be mad at me for doing this, but I couldn't stand to be in that theater anymore. Even if Judgment was the greatest movie ever made, I wasn't going to see it. I went back through the lobby, but the old man wasn't there. Then I found a dollar store in the mall that didn't seem too gross, and I spent 90 minutes wandering through the aisles and looking at whatever they had. I didn't buy anything. I saw 3 other customers in there, all getting cigarettes. Once I waited long enough, I went back to the theater, but all the lights were off. The glass doors were closed and covered in black paper. The theater looked like it had been closed down for a long time. I tried to open the door, but it was locked from the inside. I banged on the glass until a janitor came over and told me to stop. I told him that my boyfriend was watching a movie inside, and he laughed. He said, "Miss, that theater's been closed for 5 years." I went to other shops in the mall, but every worker told me the same thing. The theater was closed. I eventually reported everything to the police. I even gave them my ticket stub, but they haven't been any help. I called Lindsay's number, but nobody answered, and I can't find Danny anywhere. It's been 8 days. I don't know if I'll ever find out what happened to them, or what that strange movie was about. I'm just glad I left when I did. When I was in college, I joined a ghost hunting club. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Either I'm stupid, because ghosts don't exist, or you think I'm stupid because ghosts are real and shouldn't be messed with. Well, good news for all of you, because there are no actual ghost encounters in this story, so you don't have to worry about ghost ethics. Anyway, there were 5 people in this club, including myself. The group had been together for 2 years when I joined, but they accepted me into their group without any issue. One of the guys, for the purpose of the story I'll call him Lee, had found this old cabin in the middle of nowhere in our town that was said to be haunted. And, being 5 bored college guys with nothing better to do on a weekend, we decided to check it out and camp overnight with some beers and music. At first, the night was unmemorable. We all drank far too much beer until we ran out, and we explored the cabin while drunkenly joking with each other and trying to knock each other over. Stupid guy stuff. Soon into our investigation, we realized that Lee was missing. The guys and I assumed he had to take a leak, so we didn't think anything of it. But then another 10 minutes went by, and still no Lee. Not wanting to, I suggested we all head outside into the woods to look for him. We called out his name for what seemed like forever, but since we were insanely drunk, it was probably about 5 minutes. I don't know when, but we all seemed to silently decide to break off in different directions to look for Lee. I just so happened to be behind the cabin when I heard something rustle in the bushes directly in front of me. I remember freezing, holding my breath as if that would save me from some axe-wielding psychopath with a thirst for blood. But when a rabbit jumped out of the bush, I let out a breath and laughed in embarrassment. I vowed then to stop watching those cheesy horror movies where the killer picked off the stupid drunk college kids one by one. Then, something moved in another bush behind me, and I felt someone throw their arm around my neck into a chokehold. I struggled, screaming for help, but the person just pulled me back and didn't let go. I screamed until I comprehended the laughter. I stopped struggling when I recognized the laugh, and Lee let me go, pointing at me with the guys as they all started mimicking my screams in between chuckling. A prank. It was all a prank. They knew Lee was hiding and wanted to mess with the new guy. At the time, yeah, I was annoyed and wanted to punch them all for nearly giving me a heart attack, for making me think I was about to be that first victim in a slasher. But I got over it pretty quickly when all the guys started itching uncontrollably. Apparently, hiding in bushes, down close to the ground in shorts and tank tops, was an easy way to get poison ivy. It was then my turn to laugh. The guys wanted to leave since they were miserable and wanted to get something to help the itching. But we were all too drunk to drive, so we decided to stay the night like originally planned. Sometime into the early hours of the morning, I needed to take a piss and went to the back of the cabin to find a tree to take care of business. Much like that night, I heard a branch break from behind me just as I was finishing up. And much like before, I froze in place and thought of killers chasing me through the woods where no one could hear me scream. Another branch broke, and I heard footsteps. But instead of getting scared, I was pissed. The guys were trying to scare me again, and even went around me, deeper into the woods, just to scare me and not alert me that they left the cabin after me. Before I could muster words, one of the guys grabbed me from behind and started pulling me towards the bushes. No matter how much I struggled, I couldn't break their hold, getting dragged further into the woods. I was too drunk to find my footing to break his hold. I screamed at them that I wasn't falling for another stupid prank as I managed to break their hold and turned to chew them out, knowing it was probably Lee again, trying to get one last good scare in before we went home, when I saw who was behind me and screamed so loud it scared even me. The person who grabbed me wasn't Lee, nor was it any of the other guys in our group. No, the person who grabbed me and pulled me deeper into the woods was a large, older man with dirty, ripped clothes, beaded eyes, and a smile that told me I was in danger. The guys started calling me, the cabin door opening, and I looked in their direction to see how close they were while trying to catch my breath to shout to them. When I turned back to the old guy, he was running in the opposite direction, laughing uncontrollably. Safe to say, none of us chased after him. We quickly packed our things and slept in Lee's too small car until one of us was sober enough to drive. So yeah, no ghosts in this story, but some things are scarier than ghosts. Like a creepy older man in the middle of the woods, just waiting for a couple of stupid college kids to lurk around in the middle of nowhere, too drunk to defend themselves.
The funeral home was downstairs, and our home was upstairs. It was scary living above somewhere that stores dead bodies. To most teens and young adults, this probably sounds cool, but as a child, it was terrifying. I would jump and get scared of every noise and creak in the house. I would often ask my dad about the afterlife. He said there were no such things as ghosts, and when we're dead, we're dead. I suppose it takes that kind of mentality to do a job like my dad's. He was the town's mortician and would prepare everything from the embalming to the makeup and of a dead body before a funeral. On this one occasion, the body of a young boy was sent to our home. His name was Michael, and he went to my school. I didn't really know him, as he was 3 years younger than me. Michael had drowned in the bath at home. A tragic story, and in such a small community town, it's something everyone feels. We had all seen or met Michael at some point or another. I remember seeing my dad's face when they brought the body into the home. Sad is an understatement. He had tears in his eyes. I'd never seen him like that before. Sometimes I used to think he wasn't human for not showing any emotion at the sight of a dead person, but this I know he felt. I'm not sure if he had ever had to prep a child before. It certainly wasn't a question I wanted to ask him. The funeral was set to be in 3 days. There had been some delays in making the arrangements due to the autopsy. Michael's parents were both under investigation due to the suspicious circumstances. The first night Michael's body was with us, I was in my room playing my PlayStation when I heard a sound of running water coming from the bathroom. I assumed it was my dad, but then I heard someone whisper my name. Thomas. I paused the game and looked to my bedroom door but couldn't see anyone. I shouted at my dad, but he didn't answer. I unpaused my game, and after another few minutes, I heard it again. Thomas. I paused the game again and went to the bathroom down the hall, thinking it was probably my dad drawing me a bath. I could hear the water running as I walked up to the bathroom door, which was closed. I opened the door slowly. The room fell silent. There were no taps running. I freaked out and ran downstairs to tell my dad. He told me to stop messing about. That was literally the extent of my dad's parenting in these situations. Stop messing about and grow up. I went back up to my room and put my game back on. I didn't hear anything else for the next 2 days. The night before Michael's funeral, I was in my room doing my homework when I heard my dad shout my name. I came to the door of my bedroom and saw my dad standing there in the hall.
Yes, Dad?
I said.
I didn't call you, son.
I looked at him confused and asked,
Then who did? I don't know, but I heard it too.
I slept in my dad's room that night, and the next day Michael's body was buried. My dad told me years later that he heard noises while Michael's body was with us. Anything from hearing water running to the TV turning on while he was sleeping, and even footsteps walking around his bedroom. I think he now believes in ghosts.
Growing up with two parents that focused more on their careers than they did me and my sister Mia, this meant that every summer we had to go and stay at our grandma and grandpa's house in the middle of nowhere. There was very little to do, and as much as we loved our grandparents, 6 weeks with nothing to do was nothing to look forward to. We would take our N64 and play Mario Kart until it wasn't fun anymore. We would sometimes go exploring, but would get into trouble if we strayed too far. One year, when I was 13 and my sister was 11, we were out playing in the fields at the back of our grandparents' house when we heard a loud exploding sound. It sounded like firecrackers or fireworks going off in the woods, but in all the years we had stayed there, we never saw anyone close to our grandparents' house, as it was miles away from anywhere. Curious as to what the noise was, me and Mia ran down to find 3 boys, all about our age, lighting firecrackers and throwing them into the air. They seemed excited to see us and introduced themselves. Their names were John, Ben, and Kevin, who insisted we call him Hyro. I was thinking that now we had some new friends to play with, maybe this summer wouldn't be so boring. For the next 2 weeks, we played out almost every day. We would go exploring together, play soccer, and even go hang out in Hyro's treehouse. While we were playing one day, Ben said that he knew of an old abandoned house that looked really creepy and asked if we all wanted to sneak out and go and explore. "It'll be much creepier at night," Ben said. I was up for it, and Mia said she would be too. I didn't really want Mia coming with us as I didn't want to be responsible for her. I knew she would be a scaredy cat and start to moan and cry as soon as we got there. So once we were back at our grandparents', I told her she wasn't allowed to come. Mia protested and said she would tell if I didn't let her come with us, so I had no choice but to let her tag along. I was angry and frustrated with her, but I didn't want to even risk her telling our grandparents. I knew they wouldn't let me out for the rest of the summer if they found out I left the house in the middle of the night. We all met in the woods at the bottom of the fields, and Ben said he would lead the way. I marched off ahead with Ben, and Mia stayed back with Hyro and John. We were talking, and I apologized to Ben for my sister coming along. "It's okay. I have an idea if you want to lose her." Ben suggested that once we've explored the creepy house, we can play hide and seek, and when everyone goes to hide, we can leave her there and go explore somewhere else. I know as a big brother, I should have been against leaving my sister in an abandoned house on her own in the middle of the night, but I was only 13 and was angry at her for threatening to tell on me. We got to the abandoned house, and as we walked around, Ben told us some stories that he had heard about the house. Apparently it was haunted, and the ghost of a little girl lingered there after being murdered by an intruder when she was only 6 years old. We had these kinds of ghost stories back home, and most of which were bullshit. The time came to play hide and seek so I could ditch my little sister, and I said I would count first, and everyone ran off to hide. I ran tiptoe out of the back door, where we all met up outside as previously agreed, and started to run through the long grass at the back of the house and into the darkness. Then my heart sank as I heard Mia scream, closely followed by a gunshot. This wasn't an "I'm afraid of the dark" scream. This was a "I'm scared for my life" scream. I started running as fast as I could back to the house, Ben, John, and Hyro following close behind. I was shaking, and every thought imaginable was going through my head. When we got to the house, we couldn't find Mia. We searched everywhere, and she was nowhere. We found a trail of blood that led out through the front door. I have never been so scared in my life. We tried to follow the blood, but we lost it in the dark. I didn't know what to do, and after looking around the area for close to an hour, I knew I had to go home and tell my grandparents. Ben, John, and Hyro all came with me, and when we arrived back at my grandparents' house, Mia was sitting there with both my grandparents and a man I soon learned to be one of the neighbors. She was still sobbing and sniffling and looking at me like she hated me, and quite understandably. When we all ran out of the back door and into the grass behind the house, a large dog or wolf of some kind had come in through the front door. Mia said it growled and snarled at her, but before it could attack, Mr. Bosley shot at it and it ran off. We don't know if the dog survived, but we do know it was hit due to the blood trailing out of the front door of the house. The question no one asked, and I didn't realize until years later, is, what was Mr. Bosley doing at the house? I'm sure there are some out there who've never accessed the dark web, and probably a fair few who have either never heard of it or think it's a myth. I can assure you, though, it is very real, and depending on how you use it, potentially very dangerous. Accessed through a series of VPNs and specialized servers, the corner of the dark web where I do most of my work is basically a marketplace, an Amazon for the illicit, the illegal, and the hard to find. Ask any police officer, and they'll tell you that nowadays, a huge chunk of the incidents involving weapons, drugs, or exploitation will in some way be traceable back to someone having supplied those things through the dark web. Though of course those products and services are small fry compared to what I do. While buying and selling illegal contraband products can be lucrative, the real money nowadays is not in solid real-world products. The real money is in information. Information is valuable, data very expensive, and secrets? Well, secrets are worth more than gold, if you know where to mine for them. What most people don't realize is that the only place that a secret is really a secret nowadays is inside your head. If you say it out loud, if you type it anywhere, tell anyone, or send it over the internet, it's no longer a secret, and we can access it. My company and site, Cross Your Heart, sells those secrets to the highest bidder. You give us a target, and we, for a price, will give you a digital secrets box, telling you at least 15 things that this person would not want exposed, with evidence. Private things, conversations, opinions, and sometimes sins that they think they've covered up, but which I and my team can easily access. The process works by trawling. People think, for example, that when they use a VPN or incognito, they're hiding their online activity, not realizing that it's all recorded with the Wi-Fi owner and that they could still see what you accessed. If we hack that Wi-Fi provider, we can see it. People think that using encrypted messaging apps will help, but they only guarantee encryption on either end. If you pay people who work for the companies to intercept, you can view any message. The same goes for bribing people in the security services. If you have people on the inside, then you can get access to it all. Nothing you have ever said or written is safe, and at any point I could access it and use it against you. A terrifying thought, right? Once we've amassed the information from every possible source, social media, messaging apps, phone records, bank accounts, secret voice recordings, CCTV footage, every line of a person's digital portrait, we then give that info to an AI program that will sift through it and present anything it deems as being a possible secret, anything that was deleted that you've tried to hide or cover up. It then condenses that into a single secrets box, a list of everything you never wanted people to know. The client then pays for the passwords, the keys to this box. Our services have exposed affairs, crimes, dangerous opinions, and very, very private habits. So far, our Cross Your Heart box services have been used in high-profile blackmail cases that have ruined reputations, brought down politicians, and forced celebrities and multimillionaires to pay extortionate amounts, many times more than what we charge to produce the box, to stop the contents being released in public. Recently, though, we've encountered a problem. You see, while it's very lucrative to expose people's secrets to those who want to know, there are some people whose secrets are very well protected, and perhaps too extreme and too hideous to be exposed or viewed at all. I, of course, cannot name names, but we were hired recently to investigate one very well-known individual and to produce a secrets box for him, showing the things he's done and said that he would not want others to know about. Usually, a box contains about 15 statements of fact, 15 secrets with evidence. This one has over 500.
things that are supposedly so awful they could send the viewer mad. It's said to include horrific, graphic photos and to involve acts so heinous that they would turn the stomach of anyone who looked at them. Not only valuable, but dangerous. I wouldn't know. I haven't opened the box. So far, 16 people have, including the person who asked for it to be made in the first place. I have not heard from any of them since. Their digital trails have gone cold, and despite several trawls of information, I've not been able to find anything on them. It's as if they not only simply fell off the face of the earth, but someone is erasing any trace that they ever existed at all. One of them, in the hours after opening the box, would not tell me what was inside, but said only that, "In all of the dark web, that is the darkest corner. It's like a black hole that just goes on and on forever." Another, when I asked what was inside, gave only a one-word answer. "Evil," he whispered quietly, before he disappeared. The box, unopened since, remains on a dark server. It's protected by multiple layers of security and passwords, though I'm not confident that even that will keep it closed. After all, nowadays, nothing stays secret for long.
I recently attended a friend's wedding, but as I left it to the last minute to book my hotel room, there were no rooms left, and I was forced to book into another hotel 20 minutes away. I didn't really pay much attention to the reviews or even the location of the hotel, as it was just a place to lay my head for the night. After drinking all day, I got an Uber to the hotel. Maybe I should have paid more attention when booking. This wasn't the nicest looking hotel, nor was it the cleanest. In fact, far from it. There were a bunch of people loitering outside that looked like they were maybe dealing something illegal. I didn't stay long enough to notice and just made my way inside. Inside wasn't much better. There was what I can only describe as a homeless man sleeping on the floor in the lobby. I went to the desk and rang the bell. An old man shuffled out of the back office, asked for my ID, and checked me into my room. I headed for the elevator, trying not to touch anything for the fear I might pick up something. As the doors opened, there was a young girl already standing there. She didn't attempt to get off or anything, which I thought was weird. I smiled at her as I got on, but she didn't even acknowledge I was there. She looked upset, so I didn't take it personally. I pressed the button to take me to the third floor, and up we went. Everything about this girl seemed over the top. Long acrylic nails, platform stiletto heels, and the biggest fake lashes I'd ever seen. I tried not to stare so I didn't make her feel uncomfortable as the elevator creaked and groaned as it ascended. When we reached the third floor, we both got off. She went right, and I went left, looking for my room number. The floorboards caved in under the carpet with every step, and I was a little afraid that I might fall through the floor. When I reached my room, I looked back, kind of hoping to offer a friendly smile to the girl from the elevator. But the hall was completely empty. I felt uneasy, and a tightness formed in my chest. Where the heck did she go? At the very least, I should have heard a door open or close, but she was nowhere to be seen. There wasn't time for her to run to the stairwell at the end of the hall. I guess technically she could have gotten back on the elevator before it had time to close. As odd as that would have been, it was the easiest explanation. I let myself into my room, which was stinky and dated, just like everything else in the hotel. There was mold on the ceiling, and the carpet looked older than the hotel, but at least the bed sheets appeared to be clean. It was almost midnight, and I was still pretty drunk. I just needed to get a few hours of sleep before flying back to Maryland in the morning. I tossed my backpack into a chair, opting to keep my clothes on. I laid down on top of the covers, turned the lights off, and passed out almost immediately. A few hours later, I woke to a woman screaming outside the door and someone violently jiggling the door handle back and forth. I remember thinking how flimsy that door was. It wouldn't take much for it to break. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the screaming stopped, and so did the door handle. It was so abrupt that my heart was pounding in my ears, and my hands were shaking as I got up to look through the peephole. The hall looked empty. I didn't see anything, so I opened the door just enough for me to look out into the hall, but again, nothing. On the chance that someone actually needed help, I dialed the front desk, but no one answered. I picked up my cell and tried in vain to turn it on, but after taking a gazillion pictures throughout the day, it was completely dead, and I had forgotten my charging cord. I felt over-anxious, and anxiety wasn't really something I suffered from. I kept thinking about that girl from the elevator. There was something about the look on her face. Was it her screaming in the corridor, needing my help? My gut told me that something awful had happened, so after trying the front desk 2 more times, I put my shoes on and took my room key in my backpack, hoofing it down to the front desk. It took like 30 seconds of obnoxiously ringing the bell before the old guy manning the front desk came out. He looked irritated, like I woke him up from a nap. I told him what happened, and he didn't seem all that surprised. I asked him if he was going to call the police, and he just shook his head, saying he would go and check the floor to make sure everything was okay. At this point, I was getting annoyed, but then he explained that other guests on the 3rd floor have mentioned the same or similar experience, but whenever he goes to check, nothing is out of the ordinary. I'm not sure what happened that night, or if it was anything to do with the lady that miraculously disappeared off the elevator, but regardless, I checked out and went straight to the airport.
When I was a freshman in high school, I made friends with the troublemakers of the school. They didn't do anything illegal, but they did like playing pranks on the public. To be a part of this group, you had to do a dare of their choosing. My best friend had done her dare at the start of the semester, but I was kind of shy back then, and I pushed mine back as far as I could. It was a few days before Halloween, and my best friend and I were invited by the group to go to the mall to get costumes. We did the normal things teenagers do. We ate mall food, talked about how much we hated our teachers, and caused as much chaos in every store we went into, until either they all got bored or the manager kicked us out. When we finally went into the costume shop, I was finally relaxing and enjoying myself when the leader of the group pointed something out in the shop that stopped us all in our tracks. A clown. There was a clown in the middle of the shop, making balloon animals for the kids who stopped to say hi. I overheard one of the kids' mothers explaining that the mall hired that clown every year to draw more attention to the shop during the holiday season, because everyone loved clowns, especially kids. Wrong. I was absolutely terrified of clowns. I asked to leave the store as soon as we saw him, but my friend just laughed me off and told the whole group about my childhood fear. And the leader of the group, seeing the golden opportunity, told me I had to complete my dare to really be one of them. She whispered into my ear the dare, and, knowing I would be made fun of mercilessly if I chickened out, I decided to just do it. I mean, how bad could it really go? So I went up to the clown, and he very kindly smiled at me and told me his name was Happy, because of course it was. He then asked me what animal I wanted and what color. Robotically and shaking with nerves, I uttered that I wanted a small pink dog. The clown smiled and then got to work making it. When it was done, he handed it over to me, looking so, well, happy. He seemed like a nice man, which made my fear of clowns lessen, but didn't lessen the fear of doing the dare. Then, I took out a bobby pin in my hair and popped the balloon he just so kindly made for me. My friends were laughing and hooting and hollering at me from behind, heckling the clown and saying some not-so-kind things. But all I could pay attention to was the look the clown gave me when I popped the balloon. His smile slowly slid from his face, and his eyes, which were once full of light and humor, turned dark and sinister. He then whispered 5 words I would never forget. "You shouldn't have done that." Terrified, I ran back to my group and I made them leave. And we did. We went to another store, and I ignored them all as I wandered behind them quietly. I didn't say anything until I noticed after a while they all were dead silent. I looked up, and I saw him. The clown. He was in the same store as us,
and he was staring right at me. He didn't say anything to me, but he wasn't smiling, and when he saw I was looking back, he raised his hand and pointed at me. As you can imagine, all my friends ran for the exit, and we went to another store, trying to shake off the creepiness of the situation. They all reassured me, who was shaking at that point, that it was just a coincidence, that there was no way the clown was following us because of a stupid little dare. Only, he was. In every store we went to, he was there, watching me. And every time he looked at me, he would point to me again and just stare at me until we all ran away like scared children. Eventually, my mother came to pick me and my best friend up, and I remember throwing myself in the back seat, looking over my shoulder for him. When I didn't see him, I relaxed in my seat and tried to shake off the fear and feeling of being watched. My parents had just started the car and were exiting the parking garage when I looked back at the parking garage mall entrance and saw a figure standing in front of it. It was the clown. My best friend told me to look away, to ignore him, but I couldn't look away. I was paralyzed by fear. I waited for the dreaded moment when the clown raised his hand to point at me, but surprising me, he didn't. No, instead he raised something that was in his hand, a small pink dog balloon animal. And just before we were out of his line of sight, the clown brought up a small knife in his opposite hand and stabbed the balloon until it deflated in his hand. Only then did he smile, like he did the first time we met. I never went back to that mall again, and I still hate clowns.
My shift would typically end at 8 p.m., but sometimes I did overtime if it was busy for the extra cash. I worked at a local independent coffee shop. As there was a music hall across the street, we would stay open late on gig nights, as this would help with takings and the tips were always good. Getting home after overtime was a more significant challenge. This happened in November of 2019, and that year there was severe snowfall. I lived with my parents, approximately 3 kilometers away from the coffee shop, and had to ride my bike home after work through the snow and sludge. Though our coffee shop had a pleasant ambiance throughout the day, it would get creepy toward closing time. Many of the staff members reported hearing strange noises and screaming coming from somewhere in or around the building. It was a relatively safe neighborhood, but there was some project housing not too far away, which brought the area down a bit. We had been so concerned with the screams that we'd even called the police once or twice, thinking someone was in trouble. But by the time they arrived, the screaming would stop, and the officers would leave without any proper investigation. I tried to find another job on several occasions, but couldn't really find anywhere within cycling distance of my home, as I didn't yet have my driver's license. This one night, I was closing the store on my own, as my colleague Lindsay had left early, as she was back first thing in the morning to open. As I was banking the day's takings into the safe, I heard someone enter the shop. I came back out of the office to see who was there, but I couldn't see anyone. I checked the front door, and it was locked. I returned to the office, but then I heard it again. The door slammed shut, and either someone entered or went out. I checked again, but there was no one out there. I was freaked out, and my heart was beating fast, so I decided to just leave and text Lindsay to tell her I hadn't done the banking. I turned off the lights, grabbed my keys and bike, and left the store. As I got outside, I saw a small boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, standing at the end of the street. I called to him, and he ran off down the alley that went round to the back of the shop. I ran after him, as it didn't appear as though anyone was with him. When I got to the alley, I couldn't see him. The alley was a dead end, so there was nowhere for him to go. As I slowly walked in, thinking he was maybe hiding behind some bins or something, I noticed the back door to the coffee shop was open. I was confident I had locked it, and as I slowly approached, I heard footsteps behind me. 2 men grabbed me and tried pulling me into the shop door. I dropped to the floor, trying to make it harder for them to pull me inside, but one of the men pushed my head to the floor and started pushing snow in my face and mouth so I couldn't breathe. Eventually, I got tired, and they were able to overpower me and pull me into the shop. Once in the shop, they tied me up, blindfolded me, and threw me to the floor. My heart was beating fast, and I had all kinds of thoughts of what they were going to do to me going around my head. I assured them I would cooperate, and they could take whatever they wanted. They took all the money they could gain access to, and some expensive equipment, and then they left me on the floor, locked inside the shop. I spent all night laying on the floor, tied up and freezing cold. I had gotten wet in the snow, and as the floor was tiling, it didn't really hold the heat too well. I was found the next morning when Lindsay came in to open up for the day shift. Lindsay called the paramedics and police, who took me home and took a statement from me. They never caught the people who did this.
When I was 16 years old, my mother moved me and my brother from New York City to a small town in Michigan. The move itself wasn't too hard, and although I was upset to leave my small group of friends behind, I was excited that I would be able to have my own room for the first time. Being the new girl, everyone in my new high school wanted to be my friend and hear everything about how glamorous New York was. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. It was expensive. The schools were chaotic with too many students and too few teachers, and there were rats and cockroaches in every apartment I had ever lived in. But, wanting to be liked, I made my home state sound better than it actually was. In return, my new friend group, a group of 5 or 6 girls, told me everything about their town and the school I was then attending. Besides a girl named Susie having gone missing late last year, the town was safe, and the kids had more freedom to roam after hours than I did back in the city. So when I was invited to my first slumber party, my mother didn't have to think twice like she used to, and felt comfortable letting me attend the party. I was so excited. I remember getting to the girl who was throwing the slumber party's house about an hour before I needed to be there. But the girl was nice, and spent that hour showing me the yearbooks from middle school of her and my other new friends. By the time the others arrived, I was relaxed and enjoying myself. We did the typical things girls do at slumber parties. Watch movies our parents would never allow us to, eat as much junk food as we could, and, of course, we talked about our crushes at school. Eventually, we grew bored with gossip, and the party girl had an idea to play a game she called Confessions. Basically, everyone wrote a confession on a piece of paper and put it into the emptied snack bucket. Then, she'll mix them all around, and every girl would pick a confession to read out loud, but not know who wrote what confession. The first couple confessions were normal. One girl stole her mother's credit card to buy a handbag she really wanted, and another girl confessed to having a crush on her brother's best friend. When it came time for me to pick my confession, I was still smiling from how much fun I was having, but the smile instantly fell from my face when I read what one of the girls had confessed. The confession, 3 words that made my heart stop. I killed Susie. I didn't read the words out loud, too confused about what I was reading and not knowing who Susie was. But then, I remembered the girls telling me about a girl who went missing last winter, about how she disappeared one night while at a party, a slumber party. I was shaking at that point, but one of the girls got tired of waiting for me to say my confession, so she took the paper out of my hand and read the words out loud without stopping to understand what she had just read. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. Then, everyone started yelling and freaking out. A couple of the girls thought that it was a cruel prank that was being played, while the other girls demanded to know who wrote the confession because they believed what the writer wrote. Me? I was staring at all of them, wondering which of them might be a killer. The girls calmed down soon after, and they all pretended like one of us didn't admit to being a murderer. And me, a teenager who didn't want to lose all her new friends because she freaked out and went home, I stayed the night. But I didn't sleep. I stayed up the whole night, wondering if Susie was actually killed, if the killer was actually in the room, if I was even safe. New York never seemed safer until that moment. The next morning, the girls didn't mention the game of confessions, and after we had a quick breakfast, we all went home. But I couldn't stop thinking about that note I read, no matter how many times the girls assured me it was a prank, and eventually, I drifted apart from that group. I made a couple of other friends that weren't as popular as my old friends, but they soon became my found family. But that didn't stop me from watching my old friends through the school day.
I matched with this guy I'll refer to as Joe on Tinder. We were talking back and forth for a week or two when he asked me if I wanted to go and spend the night at his place. I was a bit apprehensive at going and said I wasn't sure if I wanted to spend the night. Joe told me it would just be to Netflix and chill, but not in the conventional sense. He said we literally would be just hanging out.
We can order a pizza and watch a movie. If you want to leave after, you're welcome to.
He assured me that his intentions were innocent and it was simply to just hang out. He seemed trustworthy, and lots of my friends had met guys for dates to Netflix and chill and said it was always okay. Joe said he would have loved to take me out as a first date, but didn't get paid from his job for another 2 weeks and didn't want to wait that long to meet me. I was still unsure, but I gave in. If I go to him, at least I can leave whenever I want, rather than trying to get him out of my house. I had never done anything like this before, so I was trying to be as safe as possible, but I know that I overthink things too. There was no intention of me sleeping with the guy. It was simply to watch some movies and get takeout. I drove to his house and parked across the street. I called him up to let him know I was outside, and he came down and let me in. The building where he lived looked like some old warehouse that had been converted into small apartments. I felt a little bit safer, knowing that I wasn't locked in a house in the middle of nowhere on my own with him. We hugged when we met, and we went up to his flat and chatted for about an hour or so. Joe seemed nice and charming, and didn't come on too strong, and he was cuter in person than in his pictures. After an hour or so, he said he had picked out a few movies to choose from. He had looked at my favorites on my profile and worked off of that. I'm a big horror fan, but also easily scared. He got us both a separate blanket, ordered a pizza, and we started the movie. After about 30 minutes, there was a knock at the door. Assuming it was the pizza guy, Joe got up to answer the door when 2 men wearing masks forced their way into the room, pushing Joe to the floor. They demanded my purse and my car keys and told me if I canceled my credit cards, they had my address and would pay me a visit. They left shortly after, and I ran to the window to watch them drive off in my car. Joe didn't seem all that concerned, considering we had just been robbed. He said I could stay the night, and he would sleep on the couch, which I did. I didn't feel safe going home, knowing they knew where I lived. I wanted to report it to the police, but Joe wouldn't allow me to use his phone to call them. He said it was better that we wait until morning, when we knew it was less likely for them to come back. I didn't really understand this, but I was in shock at the time, and I trusted Joe, so I took his advice against my own better judgment. The next morning, Joe dropped me at the station. He said he was known to the police and didn't want to get involved. He asked me to make up a lie, saying I was mugged walking down the street, or to say it happened outside my own house. When I gave all my details, including my home address, to the police officer interviewing me, she told me they had received a call about a disturbance at my house the night before. The police responded and found 2 men in my home robbing the place. They had my car loaded with stuff. The 2 men said they knew me and were helping me move house. They were arrested due to the amount of mess they had left behind and for the fact that the police tried to call me, but my phone was found on one of the men. They showed me pictures of the men and asked if I knew them. I didn't know them, but I did recognize one of them. He was in one of Joe's profile pictures on Tinder. Turns out this guy squealed on Joe, and they were all in on it together. This guy even lived in the same building, which is how they got through the main door to the building. A vital detail that I missed. That's why Joe didn't want me to call the police, and why he didn't want to come into the station and report the robbery. I was such an idiot. When I thought about it, they didn't even take anything from Joe. Joe had a car, phone, laptop, and was wearing a nice watch, and they didn't take any of it.
I'm a relatively well-known gamer on YouTube and other social media platforms. I'm not super famous or anything, but I do have a decent following, and for this reason, I would like to keep my identity anonymous. I had been gaming for about 6 months when I received a message through Kik asking if I wanted to partake in a meet in a nearby city. Truth be told, I thought it was a scam from the get-go and asked for some more info, and a man who called himself Henry said that I wouldn't need to pay for anything and that he would be renting out an Airbnb for us all to stay and game in.
It sounded too good to be true, and I said I wasn't interested. Henry said they were developing a new platform that had some investors, and it was all 100% funded and legit. They had all the connections to make it happen, and had been watching me for a while, and believed we could help each other out. As much as my mom and my friends mocked me for wanting to be a professional gamer, I would do anything to try and elevate my status and earn a living from gaming, and so I decided I was all in, despite how much it sounded like a scam. Henry then sent me the booking confirmation of a house he had rented through Airbnb. The receipt read $1,200 for a weekend. This was crazy, and it looked super cool. The fact it had been booked and paid for proved the legitimateness of the event. The rooms all had double beds and ensuite. There was a hot tub outside in the garden, and there was nothing for kilometers around us, so we could be as loud as we wanted. The only condition was I had to bring all my own gear for the setup. I knew this was going to be a hassle, but it seemed worth it. It was a 2-hour drive away from my house, and so I set off in plenty of time with all my gear loaded in the back of the car. I was hella excited. I arrived at the address given to me just as it was starting to turn dark. I noticed straight away that there were no other cars in the driveway. I wasn't sure what was going on, so I went up to the door and knocked. There was no answer, and there were no lights on inside, meaning I was the first one there. I was in the wrong place, or no one else was coming. I walked around the house looking for any signs of life, but I found no one. I checked the details Henry had sent me. I even checked the pictures on the Airbnb app, and I was definitely in the right place. I decided to wait it out, and after about 30 minutes, I heard a rustling coming from the bushes about 60 feet to my right. I wasn't sure if this was a wild animal or not, but I didn't want to take any chances, and so I jumped in my car and reversed so I could shine my headlights towards the bushes. As I did, I saw a shadowy figure, which looked like that of a man, run off into the trees. I was getting scared now. I had arrived a little early, but we were now 20 minutes past the official meeting time, and no one else had turned up. I messaged Henry to find out where he was. As soon as I sent it, I could see he had seen the message, but he never replied. I said to myself that I was going to give it another 10 minutes, and then I was going to leave. 10 minutes later, no one else had arrived, and I had had enough. I put my car into drive and left for home. I never mentioned that the Airbnb was up a long drive on a private road, and as I was driving down, I noticed a car parked with its lights off, set back amongst the trees. I never noticed it on the way up, and it would have been easier for me to see from the other side, and due to it still being daylight. Something wasn't right, and I was starting to feel more and more like this was a setup. Just as I was going to pull off the private road, I noticed a faint shadow of a car tailing me. It had to be the car I had passed in the trees, and it still didn't have its lights on. I put my foot on the gas and was out of there as quickly as possible. I eventually got to the highway, and I didn't see anyone following me, so I decided to ease up off the gas. I was shaking and anxious and felt like I needed to pull over, but just wanted to get myself home. I kept checking my mirrors, making sure nothing was following me, and eventually I arrived home close to 6 hours after I had left. I never heard from Henry again. I was talking to my friend about the whole ordeal a few days later, and he suggested contacting Airbnb about the booking. They told me it was canceled a few days before, and the person that rented it received a full refund. The weirdest thing was, I had spoken to Henry that day, and he asked me what gear I was bringing to make sure he had enough plugs and extension cords for everyone. I think they planned on stealing my gear when I was there, as they knew I had over $2,000 worth of equipment. Luckily, they weren't stealth sneaking up on me, and I was able to get away unharmed and with all my gear. I grew up using public transport from a very young age. For me, it was something normal. Into my teenage years, it was a normal part of my day-to-day life. Naturally, when I was getting older and further into my college career, when I started to take the subway on my own several times a week, it was fine for me. Oddly enough, it almost gave me a sense of freedom, until one day, things took a very unsettling turn. When this situation unfolded, I was 21.
I had taken the subway earlier in the day to a friend's house because she was having a get-together at her new home. Plus, it was her birthday, so it was a 2-for-1. I had already requested the next day off work and everything, just so I wouldn't go to work feeling miserable. Well, I managed to make it to her house in one piece, and the festivities started right away. We spent time catching up with other friends who we hadn't seen in what felt like ages, and snacking on this highly elaborate taco bar that she must have spent a fortune on. As most people believe, it's not a taco party without margaritas. I had more than intended, but when things started to die down, I cut back. She offered to let me sleep over, but I just didn't really want to. I'm a sucker for my own bed. Considering everyone had been drinking, I just decided I'd take the subway back towards my home. One of the other partygoers had to walk past the station, so she made sure I got to where I needed to be before continuing her way, and I casually strolled inside. This is where things got creepy. I don't get spooked easily, but there was just something that felt strange about the atmosphere that night, and I did my best to ignore it. As I was getting on the subway, and since it was later than usual, everything was rather quiet. The seats weren't packed full, and everyone did their best to not crowd around other passengers, which was a nice change from the hours I typically had to take the subway. My mind was still a bit foggy, but not completely inebriated. Feeling the weight of exhaustion starting to blanket me, I tilted my head onto the glass behind me and closed my eyes. I double-checked my surroundings before I did that because it's still public. However, about 30 seconds later, I could tell I wasn't alone. This is awful to say, but I could smell something that was almost like urine. Instinctually, I found myself holding my breath, but it just got stronger and stronger. Then, my silent reverie was interrupted when I felt something hit my knee, hard. It was enough that it caused me to jerk back and smack my head on the window behind me. Before I could react, I felt more grabbing, and it wasn't me doing it. I opened my eyes to see this strange man with one hand on my knee and one towards the back of my head. It felt as if he was trying to fold me onto myself, like a door-hanging makeup holder. Not even bothering with politeness, I yelped and stood up, quickly scurrying to a further seat. Still, his hands stayed stuck as if they were still on me. As I sat down, I could still feel him staring. I didn't feel comfortable enough to zone back out, so instead, I stared blankly ahead, awaiting my stop. Now that I could finally get a clearer picture, I noticed the man wasn't old. He was maybe in his early 40s. His hands were caked in dirt and grime. His clothes were soiled and dingy. Even his face had smudges on it. I tried to sit there and ignore him. I didn't want to acknowledge him anymore. He left me with this super unsettled feeling. My plan didn't work, to my chagrin. I heard him clearing his throat, and when I cut my eyes his way, he held his hand up and did this wave where he put his fingers down one by one while he was hunched forward just a tad. I'm sure my face gave me away, but he didn't seem to notice.
"Hey there, aren't you just the cutest little baby there is?"
I felt my stomach turn, almost like I took a sip of spoiled milk. The words were stuck in my throat, and if I'm being honest, I didn't want to respond.
"I'm talking to you, hey!"
His temperament changed so fast. He slapped the window beside him. His face went beet red, and it was enough that you could see it through the grime that caked his skin. I twisted my face around, and it was such a relief to see that my stop was literally right there. I had maintained peace long enough that I could escape the little tube that was now stifling me. I braced for the stop and looked like a runner ready to bolt. As soon as the door slid open, I grabbed my bag and fled into the dark and cold night. It wasn't until I was completely out in the open that I heard footsteps approaching behind me, quickly. It sounded like they were trying to jog to keep pace with me. When I turned, I saw the creepy old man from the subway indeed nearly jogging my way. I tried to pick up the speed and watch him, all while not running into anything in front of me, but it wasn't easy. He kept pace pretty good, considering how stiff he had been on the subway. I kept running, and he started to shout extremely inappropriate words my way. I did my best to block them out, focus on running, and get away. He continued to scream at me from behind, and I could feel my own energy reserves starting to run down rapidly. I willed myself to keep going. Then it happened. My shoe got stuck, and I saw the ground coming at my face rapidly. I flung my arms out in front of me to try and break my fall, and when I hit, it knocked the wind out of me. I quickly flipped onto my back and watched as this stranger did this strange limping run right up to me. Before I could even scream, the man was struck with such a force he flew sideways. When I managed to sit up straight, 2 other people came running my way, both women. They held out their hands to help me up. The force that hit the man was one of their husbands, football tackling him. As we all waited around for the police, I found out that they had had a run-in with him before too. He was known to do this type of thing. I just didn't take the subway at this time usually, so I never saw him. When they saw him take off after me, they decided to intervene. They claimed he's never caught up to anyone, but they didn't want to know what happened if he did. Needless to say, he was put into a cruiser and removed. I haven't ridden the subway at night since though. Lesson learned.
When I was about 14, I used to babysit a few kids from families who knew my parents. There was this one kid named Mike who lived on my street. Mike was about 6 or 7 at the time, and his parents often went out with friends for meals to high-end restaurants and bars. I used to babysit Mike at least once a week, and the kid took a real liking to me, and he was never any trouble, so it used to be a lot of fun. Looking back, he was probably my most favorite kid to babysit. I learned that letting kids stay up a little past bedtime gave me some leverage to get them to behave and do as they're asked. I would always let Mike stay up a little past bedtime. We would play Plants vs. Zombies for hours and have Mario Kart contests. His dad was an avid gamer, so he had lots of different consoles all set up in a spare bedroom or man cave on the upper floor. We weren't allowed to play in there, so Mike's dad would set up some games downstairs for us. On this particular occasion, I arrived about 6 p.m., just as Mike's parents were due to leave. They gave me the same instructions they did every time. Keep the doors locked, help yourself to anything in the fridge, no liquor past 8, and in bed for 9. The liquor was a joke, but a joke they made every time. They'd ordered us a pizza, and once they left, we sat down straight away to start our gaming. After about an hour or so, the batteries in Mike's controller died. Mike mentioned his dad had a charger pack upstairs in his room and said his dad wouldn't get mad if we went in just to get it. Mike ran upstairs, and I went to get us some more sodas. As I was in the kitchen, I heard a loud bang and a scream. Mike came running down the stairs in a panic, shouting some gibberish saying someone else was in the house. He wasn't really making much sense, and so I had to calm him down in order to actually string a sentence together. Mike told me that he got the battery pack, and as he was walking out of the room, he heard a creak behind him. He turned around and couldn't really see anything, but as he turned to leave, he saw a shadow behind the curtains that was highlighted from the streetlights outside. I told him it was probably just a trick of the light and that I would go and check. I wasn't overly concerned, as I know how kids always think there's something under the bed or in their closet. Mike wasn't usually one of these kids, but I knew all the doors were locked and it was a safe neighborhood. Mike didn't want to be left alone, so he came upstairs with me and took me to where he saw the shadow. There was no one there. We checked the other rooms too, and nothing. We went back downstairs and continued to play games, when all of a sudden we heard a loud crash and what appeared to be footsteps moving around upstairs. Me and Mike looked at each other, showing fear in our eyes. I grabbed Mike's hand, dropped the controller, and ran out the front door. We went to the Winston's house next door and banged as loud as we could, screaming to call 911. We explained what happened, and despite Mrs. Winston's pleas, Mr. Winston grabbed a baseball bat and ran round to the house. Mr. Winston was a relatively stocky guy, and you could tell from his stature that he was definitely some kind of athlete or bodybuilder or something, especially in his younger days. Mr. Winston came back about 10 minutes later, just as the police were arriving. He told the police that he didn't find anyone inside, but he did notice the back door was wide open. I remember hearing the police saying it was likely that whoever it was long gone, but they would check everything just to make sure it was safe. About 20 minutes later, the police came out with a man in cuffs. Neither me or Mike recognized the man, and as it turns out, he opened the door as a decoy and went to hide in the basement. The weird thing is, there's no way this man could have gotten into the house when I was there, as I was always making sure everything's locked, which means he was already in the house. I never did find out why they believed him to be there, but I never babysat for Mike after that. To be honest, I never babysat anyone. It wasn't that I was scared. I just didn't want to be responsible for someone else's child if ever there was another break-in. Next time, we might not be so lucky, and I really didn't want that responsibility. When I was about 11, I lived with my mom and sister, who was a couple of years older than me. We didn't get along very well and would often fight, so my mom couldn't leave us alone if ever she went out. We'd recently moved to a new part of the city after my mom and dad broke up, and I made some friends quite easily. After living there for a few months, my new friends asked me if I wanted to go to a sleepover at some guy's house called Liam, who was a local support worker. They assured me he organized a lot of the local under-16s functions in the area, and they often went to stay and play games, and he was trusted by all their parents. I asked my mom, and being a good mom, she said she wanted to meet Liam first. He seemed pretty ordinary, well-dressed, polite, and a relatively good-looking guy. After meeting him, my mom said it was okay for me to go and stay with my friends, but told me to be back early the next day. There would usually be about 6 to 8 of us that would go together. We would all buy junk food and then play games and watch horror movies while slumming it on the living room floor. I went a few times with all my friends, and even though Liam was an adult, it was like being left unattended. He would just sit there and allow us to be boys and laugh when we would prank and scare each other. One day my mom was in need of a babysitter at the last minute and asked me if I would ask Liam if he was free and said she would pay him. I called him and he agreed and came to pick me up. He took the money my mom gave and bought us a pizza on the walk home. Everything was fine and there was never anything suspicious to report. Whenever my mom needed a babysitter, she asked me to ring Liam and he never said no. One cold winter evening, when playing out with my friends, Liam came round and asked if we all wanted to have a sleepover. We all said yes, and he told us to make sure we all asked our parents. He was always upfront about it, so there was never any reason for anyone to be suspicious. We all ran home, and those of us that were allowed came back with sleeping bags, pillows, and either food or money to buy food. As usual, we all stayed up watching horror movies, and when it got to about 2 a.m., Liam stated that we should all get some sleep. It was freezing cold that night, and Liam mentioned he had a new double bed, and we could all sleep in it. About 4 or 5 of us, myself included, fought our way to have a spot on the bed. Once we were all settled, Liam came in and got into bed with us. It seemed a little strange, but I was in my sleeping bag, so felt pretty safe. Plus, we'd stayed many times before, so I didn't think anything of it. I'm not even sure most would know of the dangers at that age. On our way home the next day, we were all laughing and joking when a marked cop car pulled up next to us. "Are any of you named Jordan?" one of the officers asked. One of us was Jordan. It turns out Jordan didn't ask his mom if he could stay over, and she reported him to the police as missing. Jordan was taken in the police car, and as Liam was a legal adult, he was arrested on the spot for kidnapping or abduction or something. Liam was never charged, but we were all interviewed, and when we told the police and our parents about us all sharing the bed, it definitely raised more questions than it answered. We were all sat down and told how this type of behavior wasn't normal, and our parents were clearly concerned and felt guilty for allowing us to be in that position. I never stayed at Liam's again after that, and I heard several years later that he'd been locked up and put on some sort of register for being in a relationship with an underage girl. I don't know if that's true, but I can honestly say that it wouldn't surprise me. Janet lived across the street from where we lived. I was 16 at the time and would babysit for her regularly. She only moved in about 6 months ago, but made friends with my mom right away and asked if I would like to babysit every now and again. She was a single mom and had 2 girls, aged 3 and 5, who we'll call Becky and Lisa. They were the sweetest 2 girls and would giggle at everything and anything. When I would babysit, I would generally put the girls to bed at about 7 p.m., and then the rest of the night was my own. Free to watch movies and text boys, that sort of thing. Both the girls slept in the same room, and there was a camera set up so I could watch them on a baby monitor. There were other cameras set up as well that covered the rest of the house, inside and out. These were all linked to Janet's phone, and she had been very honest and upfront about them, and said these weren't to spy on me, but for all our safety. I didn't mind and knew she would probably check on them every now and again, just to make sure everything was okay without having to disturb me. Janet was cool and would let me watch things I shouldn't without telling my parents. She would also make sure there was plenty of root beer and yummy convenience foods for me to indulge in once they were asleep. On this one particular night I was babysitting, Janet was working late and wouldn't be home until after midnight. I followed my usual routine and eventually fell asleep on the couch and was awoken to the house phone ringing. It was Janet. She was frantic and crying, saying she could see the silhouette of a man standing in the corner of the girl's bedroom. Without thought, I ran upstairs and ran straight into the bedroom, switched on the light, to find no one there. Janet was still on the phone. I told her there was no one there and even checked the closets and other rooms just to make sure. Janet appeared confused and said that no one left the bedroom as she was watching on the hall cameras and was convinced she saw someone in there. She settled down and said she would see if she could finish early and would be home as soon as she could. I told her not to rush and that everything was okay. I went back downstairs and helped myself to some pizza and rewound my movie to where I fell asleep. I continued to check the baby monitor frequently, and there was no movement of any kind. After about an hour or so, I heard crying from upstairs. I casually got up off the couch and walked up to the bedroom, thinking nothing of it, and flicked the light switch. Nothing but darkness. I got goosebumps as I entered the room, but didn't want to overthink it, as it was probably nothing. I went over to Becky, who was crying, and picked her up to comfort her. As I looked up, I noticed the closet door to be open slightly. I was certain I closed it earlier. I continued to look around the room while my eyes were still adjusting to the darkness, and then I saw the figure of a man standing in the corner of the room. He was dressed all in black with a hood up, so I could barely see his face, but I could see his eyes, and he was looking right at me. I froze. I didn't know what to do. We just stood there staring at each other for what seemed like an eternity. The man slowly started walking around the room, keeping eye contact with me. As he got closer to the door, he made a run for it downstairs and out the front door. I ran downstairs and locked the door and called my dad to come over. My dad stayed with me until Janet arrived home. Janet checked the footage with me, and my dad's still there. The man came out of the closet. I wasn't sure how this could happen, as I know I checked, and it was definitely empty. We all went upstairs to have a closer look, and found a trap door in the floor of the closet. Janet said she had never noticed it before, and I definitely didn't notice it. She had lived there for 6 months at this point, and was completely unaware of this door in the closet, and in her child's room no less. It was designed to be hidden, like a low-key panic room of some kind, so it kinda made sense that it had gone unnoticed. My dad climbed into the small space and said it was trashed, like someone had been living there. We don't know how he got in, or if it was possible to re-enter from the outside. Janet stayed with us that night with her kids, and the next day someone came to secure it. It was reported to the police, but we never found out who the man was.
I used to love spending time in nature when I was younger. I grew up and it was something that never left. The only time that love wavered was after I spent a few weeks working at a summer camp in the middle of the wilderness. It was for a church that my grandparents used to attend when I was a small child. This camp was in the middle of the forest and it was primitive. It didn't have air, televisions, and everything was shared. Right away, I didn't like being there, but I couldn't just walk away. I decided I'd stick it out. Looking back, I should have left right then. What started out as a part-time summer job slowly turned into something else. Despite screaming kids of all ages at any given time, there was something desperately wrong with the woods themselves. I never felt quite free like I had in many other woods. What really got me was one portion in particular, though. It was right at the edge of the camp's borders. If you looked one way, you saw the pool. The other way held a wide expanse of just wilderness. You could barely see through the trees, and when the sun went down, you couldn't even see your hand in front of your face. One night, we did a camp-wide scavenger hunt, and we were set to groups of 5. We were supposed to meet back at the sawdust floor chapel within 2 hours. Whoever made it first won. Well, things were going great until about an hour in. I did a head count,
and realized we were missing one. I tried not to panic and instead called the boy's name, but when I got a response, it didn't seem reasonable. The reply came from beyond the border, in the woods. The other kids looked around, and all denied seeing him go past them, but instead of wasting time, I found another counselor to watch my group and figured I'd just use my light to go and get him. Walking into the woods, I used the light on the ground so I wouldn't step on anything, or, run into wildlife that could potentially bite me. I remember giving myself pep talks as I went deeper into the darkness. After I made it far enough that the light behind me was dimming, I called his name again. For a few moments, there was nothing but crickets. I tried again, and this time, I heard giggling. It wasn't the innocent giggles either. This sounded like nothing I had ever heard before. It sounded almost like laughter emanating from every direction. Then, I heard footsteps approaching. It sounded close enough that if I turned, something would be there. I didn't want to know, so I kept going forward. This time, a ruffle of leaves came from in front of me. I stopped cold. I used my flashlight and saw the bush moving with my own eyes. I hesitated as I sidestepped away. I tried to push the image away. It seemed the deeper I went into the woods, the more disconcerting things became. It was like I had walked in a circle. I was sure I passed the same weird-shaped tree already. I also lost track of the time. It seemed like hours had passed when I made it to the same tree again. Defeat flooded me, and I was just about ready to turn around, when, out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of something child-sized running through the trees at full speed. I could see the branches as they were unceremoniously shoved out of the way. Not hesitating, I ran full speed. I didn't want him to trip or end up hurt. Darting after him, I started to hear more laughing. When I was just about to catch him, I tripped and landed in the middle of an open slice of land. However, he wasn't there. Nothing was. Even the insects stopped talking, and it felt like I was in my own soundproofed room. Then, all of a sudden, it wasn't quiet anymore. I heard it low at first. It was faint, but there. It was like I could feel it in my palms as it vibrated off the damp earth beneath me. It was a rumble. No, it was a growl. Not only was it a growl, but it was behind me. My mind wandered through what type of animal it could be, but this wasn't any animal I had heard before ever. This was carnal and enraged. Not really wanting to, but knowing that not having a clue what was behind me left me at an extreme disadvantage, I forced myself to roll onto my back. Looking into the trees behind me, I saw something. I say something because I don't know what in the world it was. It had eyes that were red. It felt like they were glowing. Not only that, but where they were resting told me whatever it was, it wasn't small. Slowly, I made myself stand, backing up slowly. The eyes stayed in place. Considering I knew roughly how the camp was set out, I hoped that if I ran left and back, I'd end up in the vicinity, and that's what I did. I took off at full speed. The light I had bounced from rock to tree as it jostled with me. From behind, I could hear laughter, followed by a growl. I watched to make sure I dodged roots and everything for fear of what happened if I fell. I felt my sides start to cramp, and I willed myself to just make that last stretch. Horrified, I heard a final snarl that seemed to be right at my heels, but at the last minute, I saw safety. I saw light. Instantly, it was gone. The air was less oppressive, and I just knew nothing would be behind me. When I busted through the tree line, I was met by another counselor. Breathless, I ushered her away from the woods and towards the cabins. I was nearly in tears as I explained that I couldn't find one of the kids, and I went after him, but there was something in the woods. The other counselor's eyes changed, and I knew I said something wrong. Still, I pushed on. It wasn't until tears were actually falling, and I was talking about getting a search team, that she stopped me. She assured me things were fine, and I was confused as to why she didn't seem concerned. As we walked inside, I saw my camper. He was sitting unharmed. I asked the other counselor where he was and how long he'd been here, and she explained that he had accidentally gotten tangled up with her campers as we passed them before even entering the pool house area. The boy looked just as confused. I asked him why he went to the woods, and he looked back at me before solemnly telling me that he never went in the woods. He was scared of the boogeyman. When I was 9 years old, I had to stay in hospital for a couple of nights with suspected appendicitis. There was this girl who I'll call Amanda for the purpose of this story. Amanda was a year or two younger than me and occupied the bed next to mine. She was a bit weird and didn't really talk to any of the other children other than repeating what people said. If there were cartoons on the television, then she would repeat the characters. If there was a doctor talking to a parent, then she would repeat both sides of the conversation. If there were kids laughing and playing, she would repeat what they were saying. Sometimes she would just be mumbling, and other times you could hear her as clear as day. I'm not sure why she was in the hospital, because other than her acting a bit strange, she didn't appear to be sick or in any pain. On the first night after lights out, I couldn't really sleep because of the shooting pain I had in my stomach. I lay there listening to her mumbling while I rolled around trying to get comfortable. I couldn't really make out what she was saying, and I didn't really care at the time. I was in too much pain to care. We had curtains around our beds for privacy, so I couldn't see Amanda or see if anyone was with her. I eventually fell asleep and awoke to Amanda talking and making sounds. I tried to listen to what she was saying, but she was talking too quietly, and I couldn't really make it out. Then I heard Amanda say,
Hi, my name's Melody. This used to be my bed. What's your name?
This freaked me out. I had only ever heard Amanda repeat what others were saying, so what was she repeating? It sent tingles down my spine. What could she hear that I couldn't? Or more to the point, who could she hear that I couldn't? I slowly pulled the covers over my head and lay there listening to Amanda talk and mumble. Eventually, I fell asleep, and when I woke up, it was morning. I asked one of the nurses when they were bringing breakfast round if she knew who Melody was. The nurse looked at me curiously and said,
Melody was a girl who used to stay here, but recently went to a better place. Why do you ask?
I told her I just heard her name and wondered who she was, and left it there. When she said she'd gone to a better place, I assumed she meant she had gone home or to a nicer hospital. As I grew older, I came to learn that going to a better place does not mean she went home. This happened to me back in the 80s, where I lived in a small town in the middle of Oklahoma. I was about 9 years old, and my mom took me shopping to our local superstore as I was off school for whatever reason. We were browsing one of the aisles when I noticed a man at the end of the aisle we were standing in who kept looking at me. I didn't really think much of it. As I mentioned, I was only 9 at the time. I continued to shop with my mom when I saw a selection of toys on the ends of one of the aisles. I asked my mom if I could go look at the toys, and she said yes, but told me to stay close. I saw this stuffed bear I really wanted. I was looking at it and trying to find a price so I could ask my mom. The man I saw earlier came up to me and offered to buy it for me.
Hey, if you come with me, I can buy it for you if you like.
My mom always told me not to talk to strangers, so when he tried to speak to me, I turned to walk away, dropping the bear. As I did, the man grabbed my arm and pulled me back, saying something about me being rude. I don't remember exactly. I pulled my arm away, said I was sorry, and ran off to find my mom. My mom was just in the next aisle where I'd left her. I told her what had happened, and she then took me by the arm, started dragging me across the store, and told me to point the man out. My mom was the kind of woman who would claw out a man's eyes just for looking at me. We walked up and down the store, but we couldn't find the man anywhere. My mom even spoke to the manager, but I don't know what came from that. We finished our shopping and went out to the car. My mom was packing the car while I stood next to her. A car that was driving past us stopped, and I just remember being pulled from behind. I screamed, and my mom turned around with a look of terror on her face. The door closed, and the car set off driving before my mom could get to me. I was kicking and screaming, and the man threatened to hurt me if I didn't calm down. I was crying for my mom and begging them to let me go. It was a woman driving. She drove for a while and then switched with the man, and she got in the back with me. I was scared and just wanted my mom. I don't really remember the scene of events after that, but probably after we'd been driving for about an hour, I heard a siren go off somewhere close to us. I tried to look around, and the woman pushed my head down to the seat. I could feel we were starting to speed up as the siren got closer. I was hoping it was for me. I could feel us slowing down as the man pulled over to the side of the road. I just remember hearing lots of shouting and screaming from the police, telling my abductors to get out of the car with their hands up. The man and the woman got out of the car. I never asked my mom what happened and how they found me, but I seem to recall her saying that someone had witnessed what happened and got the license plate number. Because of this, it was handed to the police, who were able to locate and find me. I try not to think about it too much, but things weren't like they are today, and if that person hadn't got that license plate, who knows where I would have ended up.
For the first 3 years that I lived next door to the Whelans, I never had any problems. The problems only started when their son Matthew came home from university. For the entire time that I had lived next door, Matthew had been away in another city. He didn't visit during holidays, except for one Christmas when I happened to be away. In the brief conversations I had with Mr. and Mrs. Whelan, they had never mentioned him, and so I was actually surprised to find out that he even existed. At first, when my mom mentioned that she had spotted him carrying stuff into the house, I was intrigued. Matthew would have been a similar age to me, and since there were not many folks of my age in the area where I lived, I actually thought at first that if we met, we might get along. I even considered inviting him out with myself and my friends, in case he found it hard coming back to town. In retrospect, though, I'm kinda glad that I didn't. For the first week after he moved in, I didn't see Matthew. I continued to wave to Mr. Whelan when I passed him in the mornings, and even to Mrs. Whelan when she peeked out from behind the net curtain. When I first saw Matthew, he was on the roof. I was heading back from a night out, stumbling, slightly drunk, up the path to our front door and attempting to be as quiet as possible so as not to wake my parents. I was looking in my purse for the key when I heard an odd whistling sound coming from somewhere above me. The sound was not a real whistle as a normal person might make to get someone's attention or to carry a tune, but rather a hissing sound. Stepping back up the path to investigate, I glanced upward and almost jumped out of my skin when I saw, perched on the roof of my neighbor's house, the figure of a young man. He was wearing only his underwear and was staring directly at me. He didn't speak, but instead again hissed through his teeth at me. I glared back, wondering exactly what he found to do on the roof in his underwear at 3 a.m., and then decided that the only polite thing to do, assuming this was Matthew, would be to wave. I raised my hand sheepishly to indicate that I had noticed him, and in essence, to say hello. He did not say anything in response, but instead simply continued to stare. Then, slowly and very deliberately, he stuck out his tongue to its fullest extent and licked his lips. Then, in an equally deliberate fashion, he pointed with 2 fingers to his own eyes, then with 1 finger at me, as if to say, "I'm watching you." As a young female, alone in the dark at 3 a.m., I'll admit I was a little unnerved by this, even if I was right outside my doorstep. The following morning, I was about to tell my mother about this incident when she preempted my words by announcing that a letter had arrived for me that morning. Looking at the envelope she passed me, I noticed immediately that there was no stamp. This letter had been hand-delivered. Inside were photographs, Polaroid photos of me from several days earlier, before I had seen or even spoken to Matthew. This already was too much. Marching over to the Whelans' place, I asked to speak to Matthew, but was told by Mrs. Whelan that he was out. She did say that she would let him know that I called. Not wanting to upset her, I did not break into my planned tirade about personal space and privacy, or tell her that her son had been taking photos of me without consent, but instead simply told her that I would come back the following day. As it happened, Matthew called on me first.
I was laying in bed around 2 a.m. and had been asleep for almost an hour when I was woken by a strange sound coming from above me. I lay still, staring at the ceiling and trying to work out what the sound could be, when, after a small pitter-patter of movement, it occurred to me that the sound was footsteps on our roof. Getting up from bed, I moved slowly over to the window and, hanging half out, tried to see if I could make out a figure moving around up there. I couldn't, but as soon as I pulled my head back inside, I again heard that same animalistic hissing. Despite the sweltering heat, I closed my bedroom window and locked it. The following day, I again called the Whelans. Again, I was told that Matthew was out. Later that day, I received another bundle of photographs through the door, this time of me sleeping. That night, I didn't go to bed, but instead sat on a deck chair in my front garden, waiting for Matthew. Clearly, he had already arrived, because around 1 a.m., he emerged from his bedroom window and climbed onto the roof of his parents' house. I asked him who the hell he thought he was, reminding him that he had no right photographing me without my consent, and that our roof was private property, not somewhere he could just decide to walk around in the middle of the night. Squatting, he looked down at me and grinned, before again making that hissing noise.
Cats walk around on the roofs every night. You don't tell them it's private property,
he said with a smirk.
You're not a cat,
I replied flatly.
Oh, but I am, he whispered, and you are a mouse. Squeak, squeak, squeak.
Rising from my chair, I entered the house and again locked the door firmly. The following day, I lodged a complaint with the police, and a few days later, Matthew moved out. I'm not sure where he moved to, or if he ever plans to come back. Did you ever read the user agreement on Facebook, Reddit, or any other social media you might have an account in? Well, I did, and I didn't like it. I value my privacy. I don't like being exposed, and I don't want no lizard boy or nepo baby watching me. And that's why I went into the deep web. I had no ulterior motives for downloading Tor or using a VPN. Never ordered a hit, never bought guns, and all my adult content pleasures were boringly legal. I just wanted to get the news on cybersecurity and new electronic scams directly from their source. But more than that, I wanted a connection. I was not employed, didn't have friends, and I was burning through my savings with antidepressants and microwave food, trying to use my more niche interests in hacktivism as a way to create meaningful connections. So when a random anon sent me an evite for his team on a penetration tech forum, I just thought, oh yeah, jackpot, and I didn't even think about it. But when I downloaded their private person-to-person chat room software and it instantly bricked my PC, I just knew that I had to be the dumbest, most pathetic motherfucker on the face of the earth. At first, I thought, okay, let's go, ransomware time. But half an hour passed and no message was sent, just a blue screen with a "Get hashtag bricked" tag on it. It took whoever tricked me about 3 hours to remember I existed, and I kept thinking, why? Why take so long? Well, to copy every single thing I had on my PC, go through it, and dox me, that's why. You know, it felt like a game of sorts at first. I didn't understand my predicament yet. I didn't get what was coming for me. I was calm, and the world was calm, just like before a storm. They broke that calmness with an unceremonious "hi," which appeared on my screen, bright green over a black background, just like an old movie. I didn't react, which prompted it to continue on its own.
Brian, I want to play a game. You interested?
I hesitated. It knew my name, my real name. I felt myself starting to slip out of reality.
I'll show you some footage, and you'll help me decide what I do with my pet. You game?
I wasn't game. I wasn't game at all. And then it started counting 10. I felt my whole body cringing from the realization he was going to force me into it.
9.
I moved my hands towards the keyboard, hesitating.
Give me an answer, Brian. 7.
I moved my hands towards the power button on my tower, thinking, what's the worst that could happen?
You won't like what'll happen to you if you don't play. 5.
I stopped.
4255!
I screamed. It was my address, at least my house number.
Just type yes.
And that I did. And then it began. A video software popped up with a 1 to 6 counter instead of a pause button. At this point, I expected gore, maybe disturbingly graphic, but it wasn't that. It wasn't that at all. It was a video, grainy and with poor audio, of a man sitting behind a bush in the dark, watching as this guy who was maybe in his late 20s walked by him. The man was breathing heavily as he held the camera and zoomed into this guy's back. The video suddenly cuts to him at his home, being watched through his window as he plays video games.
Watch and learn
popped up on the screen, covering it entirely. It went black, and then jumped to a second video, with the counter going up. It was the same man, having something to eat at a local joint. I knew that joint. I loved it. And seeing it there was intense. Really intense. I felt sick to my stomach. I wanted to stop, but felt like I couldn't, like it would know if I didn't watch, if I walked out of the room and let it play itself.
Favorite foods?
It said, before repeating the same process. The videos went like this until number 4, covering mundane things, getting increasingly close to the poor dude, and even talking with him in number 4. At number 5, however, it escalated. It was night, and the dude was being followed. Slowly at first, with him sometimes glancing back as if he knew something wasn't right, but then really fast and running when he decided he wanted to do something about it. That guy went far. Further than I would have been able to, if I'm being honest. He ran for a solid mile and even climbed a fence before being caught, but he was caught nonetheless.
He had his shot,
the video said, before jumping to number 6. Number 6 wasn't long. It was a video from a dark cell with a man inside, the same man that was being followed. The video was sped up many times over, with at least a few hours going by as he slept. When he woke up, he staggered towards a door, banged on it a few times, and then fell towards the door when no one answered, sobbing.
Most dangerous game officially tamed,
appeared on my screen with
hooray
and fireworks sound effects. A 6-sided die appeared with a list under it. 1. Death. 2. Acid. 3. Saw leg. 4. Saw arm. 5. Stick. 6. Freedom.
Play.
I knew what it wanted to do, but I didn't know why. I thought about asking. I even moved my hands toward the keyboard, but then it repeated,
4255, play.
And play I did. The die rolled for an obnoxious amount of time, with sound effects and everything, finally falling on number 2, and only then I realized what was about to happen. I got up. I thought, no way in hell I'm seeing this, it's over. But before I could even look away, someone just opened the door and threw a liquid-type substance at him. It was acid, like actual acid, with him squirming around for a while as his muted screams echoed through my screen, chilling my soul in a way I thought nothing could ever top. But I was wrong. Once the man stopped agonizing, the camera stayed on him for a few minutes, and then a new phrase appeared.
Thanks for playing. See you in our next game.
The screen flickered, with a still image of my front yard appearing.
Lockdowns are scary, and most kids probably won't ever experience a real lockdown. But for me, I'll never forget mine. As far as lockdowns go, across the nation we're taught to lock doors, turn off lights, hide at the back of the class, or hide under the table. But what happens if a lockdown happens when you're not in class? It's all down to you. You need to have your wits about you and try to apply common sense of where to hide. This is life or death. I'm a female, and I needed to be excused from class and was given a hall pass. I was heading towards the bathroom when that dreaded sound came through the school tannoy saying lockdown was now in place. We were usually forewarned about drills, but not always, so it was hard to know whether to take it seriously or not. For anyone listening, always take it seriously. I decided the smartest thing for me to do was to hide in the girls' locker room, which was the closest room for me to get to, and had a bathroom towards the back. I hid in one of the stalls there. I had left my phone in my backpack in class, so I couldn't even text anyone to find out what was going on, or if it was safe to go back to class. I sat there, waiting patiently, when someone else entered the locker room. They seemed to pace around a bit, checking lockers, and then came into the bathroom. I could see the shadow under the door as I tried to be as quiet as possible and not to make any sound. Whoever it was then went into the stall next to mine. I was shaking. I had no idea who this was or if this was a drill or not. After a couple of minutes, I heard a male voice come from the stall next to me.
Hello?
I wasn't sure if I should answer or not, but I think it was obvious I was there, as I couldn't help but shuffle my feet and move my bum to stop it going numb. I decided to answer.
Hey, who is this? Do you know what's going on?
My name's Kyle. I'm not sure, just stay here and stay quiet. I felt somewhat safer knowing there was someone else in there with me and looking out for me. I then heard the distant creak of the door hinge as the door to the main locker room opened. I placed my hands over my mouth and lifted my feet off the floor and closed my eyes and just sat there. I could hear footsteps walking around. It sounded like there was more than one person, and then it went quiet. After a minute or two, I asked Kyle,
Do you think it's safe to go out now?
Kyle didn't answer. I whispered his name 3 or 4 times, and then I heard some commotion coming from the locker room. It sounded like someone being thrown against the lockers and taken to the floor. Another member of staff came in shouting my name. I had been reported as missing from class, and they were sent to look for me.
It's safe. You can come out now.
As I came out of the stall and into the locker room, they had some guy face down on the floor. He looked at me out of the corner of his eye and said, "Hi, I'm Kyle. Nice to meet you." My stomach dropped when I realized the person I was supposed to be hiding from was right there with me. My parents were called, and I was later questioned by police, but we were never told anything as a result of the arrest or why he was there.